If you want to eat here, you kneel first." The words didn't just land. They echoed, sharp and deliberate, cutting clean through the soft hum of conversation and clinking silverware. And for a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to pause without realizing it had done so. Under the warm amber glow of pendant lights, where polished wood tables reflected the quiet elegance of a place that charged $40 for a steak and called it an experience, a man stood at the center of it all, unmoving, his coat worn thin at the elbows, his shoes dulled by miles of walking streets that never remembered his name. And in front of him, Daniel Whitmore held his stance with the calm authority of someone who had never been told no, his tailored suit crisp, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed not with anger, but with something colder, dismissal. A few guests shifted in their seats, forks hovering midair, not quite sure whether to look away or lean in, because something about the moment felt staged and real at the same time, like watching a scene unfold that no one had paid for, but everyone would remember. The old man, Elijah Brooks, didn't speak, not right away, his breathing steady, his gaze lowered just enough to avoid confrontation, but not enough to suggest defeat. And there was a stillness in him that didn't match the way people usually responded to humiliation. No trembling hands, no raised voice, just a quiet presence that seemed almost out of place in a room designed for noise disguised as sophistication. Daniel took a small step forward, the polished heel of his shoe tapping once against the hardwood floor, a subtle signal that patience was thinning, and though his voice remained even, there was no mistaking the expectation behind it. "We have standards here," he added, just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. And that was all it took for a ripple of uneasy attention to spread outward, phones not yet raised but close, conversations dissolving into whispers that floated like dust in the air. Elijah's fingers tightened slightly around something in his hand, something small and worn, edges softened by time, and for a fraction of a second, the overhead light caught it. Just right, a faint reflection flashing across its surface before disappearing again, unnoticed by most, but not entirely invisible. Somewhere near the window, a young girl stopped mid-bite, her eyes narrowing with curiosity, not judgment, as she leaned forward just enough to see past the line of shoulders, her gaze drawn not to the manager, not to the spectacle, but to the object the old man held as if it mattered more than anything else in that room. Daniel exhaled slowly, measured, as if giving one final chance. "It's simple," he said, his tone controlled, rehearsed in the way authority often is. "You show respect, or you leave." And the word respect hung there, heavy with implication, bending under the weight of everything it didn't say out loud. Elijah's shoulders rose with a quiet breath, then fell, and in that small motion, there was something deliberate, something chosen rather than forced, and without a word, he lowered himself, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a slow, careful movement that made the scrape of fabric against wood sound louder than it should have been, his knee meeting the floor with a soft, muted contact that somehow carried across the room like a signal. A glass clinked somewhere in the distance. Someone coughed. Someone else looked away too quickly, but most just watched, suspended between discomfort and curiosity, unsure whether they were witnessing cruelty or compliance, unsure which one unsettled them more. Daniel straightened, slightly, satisfied in a way that didn't show on his face but settled into his posture, his hands resting calmly at his sides as if order had been restored, as if this moment fit neatly into the world he understood. And yet, beneath the warm lights, with the scent of grilled meat and polished wood hanging in the air, there was a tension that refused to dissolve, a quiet imbalance that lingered just beneath the surface, carried in the way Elijah kept his grip on that small, worn photograph, his thumb brushing its edge once, almost absent-mindedly, as though whatever it held was the only thing keeping him anchored, the only thing that made this moment something other than what it appeared to be. And though no one said it, not yet, something had already shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in glass that no one notices until it spreads. The room did not return to normal after that sound. Not really, because even as conversations tried to resume and glasses were lifted again, there was a hesitation woven into every movement, a subtle awareness that something about what had just happened did not sit right, and it showed in the way a man at the bar stirred his drink a second too long without sipping, In the way a couple near the corner table leaned toward each other but did not speak, their eyes drifting back again and again. Toward the center of the room where Elijah remained, still on one knee, his posture steady, his head slightly bowed but not in submission, more like someone carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the floor beneath him. Daniel Whitmore glanced around once, a quick scan, practiced, ensuring the order he believed he had restored was holding, and for the most part, it was, or at least it appeared to be, because no one challenged him. No one stood up, no one said a word, and that silence, to him, meant agreement, meant confirmation, meant he had done what was necessary to protect the atmosphere of a place that prided itself on exclusivity and control. But then his eyes flicked back to Elijah, and there was something there that did not resolve, something about the way the old man held that small photograph, not loosely, not carelessly, but with intention, like it belonged in his hand even here, even now. And Daniel felt a brief, almost imperceptible irritation, not because of defiance, but because of the quiet dignity that refused to disappear. Elijah shifted slightly, just enough for the light above to catch the edge of the photograph again. And this time, the reflection lingered a fraction longer, enough for the young girl by the window to see more than just a glint, enough for her to tilt her head and narrow her eyes as if trying to place something she could not yet name. Her fork resting untouched on her plate as her attention locked onto that single detail in a room full of distractions. A server passed by with a tray of drinks, hesitating for a split second before continuing, her steps softer now, her gaze lowered as she moved past Elijah, as if acknowledging him without drawing attention to it. And that small, almost invisible gesture did not go unnoticed by the older man, whose eyes lifted just slightly, not to meet hers, but to register the kindness in motion, fleeting as it was. Daniel cleared his throat, the sound controlled, measured, a signal that the moment had stretched long enough. "All right," he said, not loudly, but with the expectation of closure. "That will be enough." And he gestured subtly toward the entrance, indicating that the next step was departure, that the scene had served its purpose and now needed to end. Elijah did not move immediately, not out of resistance, but out of something quieter, something internal, and as he slowly rose from the floor, his movements careful, deliberate, there was no rush, no scrambling, just a steady reclaiming of balance, his hand never leaving the photograph, his thumb brushing across its surface once more as if grounding himself in whatever memory it held. A chair scraped softly somewhere behind him, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough to reveal that control, while maintained, was not absolute. The young girl stood now, her small frame barely noticeable among the seated adults, but her eyes were fixed, intent, and she took a step closer to the aisle, drawn not by spectacle, but by recognition, the kind that begins as a feeling before it becomes a thought, her voice still silent but gathering. Elijah turned toward the door, his coat shifting with the movement, the fabric worn but clean, and as he passed beneath the central light fixture, the photograph angled outward for just a moment, enough for its image to face the room, not fully revealed, not yet, but no longer hidden either. And in that brief exposure, something changed again, subtle but real, like a second crack forming alongside the first, invisible to some, undeniable to others. Daniel followed the movement with his eyes, his expression composed, but there was a flicker there now, something that did not belong to certainty, something closer to unease, though he would not have named it that, not yet, because from where he stood, everything still appeared to be under control. The room still intact, the order still preserved, and yet, beneath the polished surface of wood and glass and carefully curated silence, a shift was building, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment it would no longer be ignored. The door had not yet opened, but the distance between Elijah and the exit felt longer than the length of the dining room, as if every step forward carried the weight of eyes that could not quite look away anymore. And though no one spoke, the silence had changed, no longer passive, no longer neutral, but filled with something unsettled, something waiting. Elijah moved slowly, not out of weakness, but with a kind of measured control that seemed to exist outside the urgency of the room, his shoulders straightening just slightly as he walked, his hand still holding the photograph at his side, the edge of it brushing against the worn fabric of his coat, and with each step, the light above shifted across its surface, revealing fragments, a corner of a building, a hint of signage, the faint outline of a figure that looked younger, stronger, standing where he now stood as a stranger. Daniel Whitmore remained near the center, his posture unchanged, but his attention no longer dispersed. Across the room, it had narrowed, focused, following Elijah with a precision that suggested something deeper than simple oversight. And for the first time, there was a hesitation in the way his fingers flexed at his side, a subtle break in the stillness he had maintained so carefully. Near the window, the young girl took another step forward, her shoes soft against the polished floor. Her eyes locked onto the photograph now with a clarity that had replaced curiosity, and she leaned slightly, just enough to catch a better angle as Elijah passed beneath another light, her breath catching quietly as recognition began to form, not fully realized, but undeniable in the way her expression shifted from observation to certainty. A man seated at a table near the aisle turned his head as well. Older, his suit less sharp than Daniel's but worn with familiarity, and his gaze lingered on the photograph longer than most, his brow furrowing as if searching through memory, as if something about the image was reaching back through years he had not thought about in a long time. Elijah slowed near the final stretch before the door, not stopping, but easing just enough that the photograph tilted again, and this time, the image faced outward more clearly, revealing a younger version of the man himself, standing in front of the very restaurant they now occupied. Though it looked different then, the signage older, the colors warmer, the edges less refined, but unmistakably the same place, and beside him, faint but visible, was a name etched into the original sign, a name that had been replaced long ago but not erased from history. The older man at the table inhaled sharply, the sound quiet but distinct in the stillness, and he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as the pieces aligned, his lips parting as if to speak, but the words did not come immediately, held back by the weight of realization settling into place. Daniel's gaze flicked to him for a fraction of a second, noticing the shift, the reaction, and something in that brief exchange tightened the air further, because recognition, once sparked, does not remain contained, it spreads, subtle but unstoppable. The young girl's voice came first, soft but clear, cutting through the quiet in a way that did not demand attention but received it anyway. "Mom," she said, her tone uncertain but insistent. "That is him." And though she did not explain further, her words carried enough conviction to draw the eyes of those closest to her, including a woman who turned, following her gaze toward Elijah, toward the photograph, toward the past that was beginning to surface in the present. Elijah did not turn back, did not react outwardly, but there was a slight pause in his step, a fraction of a second where his movement slowed, as if he felt the shift without needing to see it, as if he understood that something had begun to change, something that no longer belonged to him alone. Daniel took a single step forward now, not enough to close the distance, but enough to signal that the moment was no longer proceeding as expected, his voice forming in his throat, but not yet spoken, held back by a growing uncertainty that he could not yet define. The door stood just ahead, the glass reflecting the warm interior light against the darker street outside, and Elijah's hand tightened slightly around the photograph as he reached for it, the image still visible to those who were looking closely enough, and in that suspended second, before the door could open, before the moment could end, the truth hovered in the air, no longer hidden, no longer distant, but not yet fully spoken, waiting for someone to give it a voice. Wait. The word came out before anyone fully decided to say it, not loud, not commanding, but firm enough to catch in the air and hold it there. And it was the older man near the aisle who finally stood, his chair pushing back with a low scrape that seemed to echo longer than it should have, his eyes fixed not on Daniel, not on the room, but on Elijah and the photograph that had not yet disappeared from view. Elijah's hand paused on the door handle, his fingers resting lightly against the cool metal, his posture still, as if he had been expecting this moment but had not planned for it. And slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned just enough for the room to see his face again, not defensive, not hopeful, just present. The older man took a step forward, his voice steadier now, shaped by recognition that had finally found its words. "That building," he said, gesturing slightly, not pointing, but indicating the image. "That is this place, before the renovation, before the rebrand." And a quiet ripple moved through the nearest tables, heads turning, attention sharpening, because now there was something specific, something real beginning to take form. Daniel Whitmore's expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, his brows drawing together as he followed the man's line of sight back to the photograph. And for the first time, he looked at it not as an object, not as a distraction, but as evidence. His eyes narrowing as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed to be true. Elijah did not raise the photograph, did not present it. He simply held it, allowing it to exist in the space between them. And in that quiet restraint, there was a confidence that did not need to announce itself. The young girl stepped closer now, her voice small but clear. "He is right," she said, glancing back at her mother before returning her gaze to Elijah. "I have seen that picture before, in the hallway near the kitchen, the old one with the black and white frames." And her words landed with a kind of innocence that carried more weight than accusation ever could, because they came without agenda, without intention beyond truth. A server nearby froze mid-step, her eyes widening slightly as memory aligned with what she was hearing, and she looked toward the back hallway instinctively, as if expecting the past to still be hanging there, framed and quiet, waiting for someone to notice. Daniel's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something more fragile, something closer to doubt, and he took another step forward, slower this time, his voice measured but no longer certain. "That photograph," he began, then paused, recalibrating. "Where did you get it?" The question hanging between them, not accusatory, but searching. Elijah's gaze met his then, steady, unflinching, and for a brief moment, the distance between them seemed to collapse into something simpler, something human. "I did not get it," he said quietly, his voice calm, almost gentle. "I kept it," and there was no emphasis, no explanation, just the statement, offered as it was. The room held its breath, not literally, but in the way movement slowed, in the way attention sharpened to a single point, because that answer did not resolve the tension, it deepened it. It suggested a history that had not yet been acknowledged. The older man took another step, closer now, his eyes scanning Elijah's face as if searching for confirmation beyond the photograph, and something in his expression softened, recognition settling not just in memory, but in understanding. "You were here," he said, more to himself than to anyone else, "before all of this," and the words carried a weight that reached further than the room, touching something older, something foundational. Daniel's posture shifted again, the certainty that had defined him moments ago beginning to fracture in small, controlled ways, his shoulders no longer as rigid, his stance no longer as fixed, and though he had not stepped back, there was a sense that the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as it had been. Elijah released the door handle slowly, letting it fall back into place with a soft click that sounded louder than expected, and he turned fully now, facing the room, facing Daniel, facing the truth that was no longer willing to remain hidden, his hand still holding the photograph. But now it was no longer just an object. It was a bridge between what was seen and what had been overlooked, and in the quiet that followed, no one spoke immediately, because the moment had reached a point where words mattered, where the next sentence would not just fill silence, but define it. No one rushed to fill the silence, because the moment had shifted into something heavier than curiosity, something that demanded care, and Elijah stood there with the same quiet steadiness, the photograph now resting fully visible in his hand, no longer hidden, no longer protected from the room, and the image it carried seemed to pull attention toward it like gravity, drawing eyes, drawing thoughts, drawing pieces of memory into alignment. Daniel Whitmore took another step closer, slower than before, his shoes no longer echoing with authority but with hesitation, his gaze fixed on the photograph as if it might change if he looked long enough, as if there was still time for it to mean something else, something simpler, but it did not, and the longer he looked, the clearer it became that the man standing before him was not just a stranger who had wandered in, not just someone who did not belong, but someone whose presence carried a history that Daniel had never considered. "You are saying," Daniel began, his voice controlled but thinner now, stretched by the weight of what he was beginning to understand, that you were part of this place. And even as he said it, the phrasing felt insufficient, too small for what was unfolding, because part did not capture ownership, did not capture origin, did not capture the kind of connection that lingers even after everything else is gone. Elijah did not answer immediately, not because he did not have the words, but because he chose when to use them, and that choice itself shifted the balance in the room, his silence no longer passive, but deliberate. And when he finally spoke, it was not to correct Daniel directly, but to offer something clearer, something grounded in truth without needing to elevate his tone. "I built it," he said, simply, and the words did not rise, did not push. They settled into the space like something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. A soft exhale moved through the room, not coordinated, not loud, but present, carried in the way shoulders shifted, in the way eyes widened just slightly. Because that statement did not just add information, it redefined everything that had happened before it. It reframed the moment of kneeling, the assumption of belonging, the idea of who had the right to stand where. The older man near the aisle nodded slowly, almost to himself, as if confirming what he had already begun to believe. "I remember," he said, his voice quieter now, reflective. "There was a story years ago about a man who started this place from nothing, turned it into something people respected," and his eyes returned to Elijah with a new kind of attention, one that was no longer searching, but recognizing. Daniel's hand lifted slightly, then stopped, as if unsure what it was meant to do, whether to gesture, to point, to steady himself, and he let it fall back to his side, his posture no longer anchored in certainty, but adjusting, recalibrating, because the framework he had been operating within no longer held, and he could feel it in the way his breath changed, in the way his next words took longer to form. "That is not possible," he said, though. The statement lacked conviction, not because he believed it, but because he needed something to hold on to while everything else shifted. "This place has records, ownership, history." And even as he spoke, the word history seemed to echo back at him differently, as if reminding him that records do not always tell the full story, that ownership can change hands without preserving origin, that history can be rewritten by those who inherit it. Elijah's expression did not change, not in challenge, not in satisfaction, but in a calm acceptance of the moment as it unfolded, and he tilted the photograph slightly, just enough for Daniel to see it more clearly, the younger version of himself standing in front of the original building, the sign bearing a name that no longer hung above the entrance, but that still existed here, in this image, in this memory, in this truth. The young girl moved closer again, standing now beside her mother, her eyes moving between Elijah and Daniel, sensing the shift without fully understanding its weight, but knowing it mattered, knowing something important was being revealed. The server who had hesitated earlier stepped forward just a fraction, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke to no one in particular. "There used to be a plaque in the back office," she said, "before the last renovation." And though her words were quiet, they carried into the space, adding another piece to the growing picture. Daniel's gaze flicked toward her, then back to Elijah, and in that movement, something in him began to give way, not fully, not all at once, but enough to create a fracture in the certainty he had relied on. And in that fracture, something else began to emerge, something unfamiliar, something closer to realization, though it had not yet taken its final shape, and the room, still and attentive, seemed to lean into that moment, waiting for what would come next. The words did not fade after Elijah spoke them. They stayed, suspended in the air as if the room itself needed time to adjust, and for a long moment, nothing moved the way it had before, not the servers, not the guests, not even the quiet background music that now felt distant and misplaced against the weight of what had just been revealed. Daniel Whitmore stood facing him, but the distance between them had changed, no longer defined by position or authority, but by understanding that had not yet fully formed. His eyes locked onto Elijah with a focus that was no longer dismissive, no longer guarded, but searching, trying to piece together a narrative that had never been presented to him. And his breath came slower now, more measured, as if each inhale carried the realization further into him. Elijah did not step forward, did not claim space. He simply stood where he was, his presence steady, his hand still holding the photograph at his side, and in the quiet that followed, his voice returned, not louder, not sharper, but softer, grounded in something that did not need validation. "There was a time," he said, his gaze not fixed on Daniel alone, but moving slightly, acknowledging the room, "when this place was not about appearance, not about who looked like they belonged, but about who needed a seat at the table." And the words did not accuse, they did not demand, they simply existed, carrying a memory that contrasted sharply with the present. A faint shift moved through the room, subtle but real, carried in the way a woman at the back lowered her glass without drinking, in the way a man near the bar straightened in his chair, because the statement did not just describe the past, it exposed the difference between then and now. Daniel's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came immediately, because whatever he might have said no longer fit as easily as it once would have, and instead, he glanced briefly around the room, not to assert control, but as if seeing it differently for the first time. The polished surfaces, the curated lighting, the carefully maintained atmosphere, all of it suddenly framed against the idea that it had not always been this way. The older man who had spoken earlier nodded again, more firmly now. "I remember the stories," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard without breaking the stillness. "People said this place was built on something real, something honest," and his eyes lingered on Elijah with a quiet respect that had not been there before. Near the window, the young girl reached for her mother's hand, not out of fear, but out of instinct, as if grounding herself in a moment she did not fully understand but could feel deeply, her eyes still fixed on Elijah, on the photograph, on the truth unfolding in front of her. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, a small movement, but one that broke the rigid posture he had maintained, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, less certain. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, not accusing, not defensive, but genuinely asking, as if the answer might help him understand how this moment had reached this point without him seeing it coming. Elijah's expression remained calm, unchanged by the question, and he looked at Daniel for a moment before answering. "Because it should not matter," he said, simply, and the words landed with a different kind of weight, one that did not rely on history or proof, but on principle. A person should not need a past to be treated with respect. And in that sentence, the entire room seemed to shift again, because the truth it carried extended beyond the photograph, beyond ownership, beyond identity, reaching into something more universal, something harder to ignore. Daniel's gaze dropped briefly, not in defeat, but in reflection, as if the floor beneath him now held more than just polished wood, as if it carried the echo of everything that had just been said. And when he looked up again, there was something different in his eyes, something less certain, less controlled, but more aware. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with understanding that was still settling into place, filled with the quiet recognition that the moment had moved beyond what anyone had expected. And as the light above cast its steady glow across the room, illuminating faces that were no longer indifferent, no longer detached, the atmosphere held a stillness that felt less like tension and more like realization, waiting for what would come next. It did not happen all at once, the realization. It unfolded in layers, quiet and undeniable, like a truth that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface for someone to finally see it clearly. And Daniel Whitmore felt it in the way the room no longer responded to him the same way, in the way the silence no longer supported his authority but instead reflected it back at him, questioning it. And he stood there for a moment longer than he intended, his thoughts catching up to the moment as the weight of Elijah's words settled deeper. His eyes moved again, not just across the room, but toward the details he had overlooked for years, the framed photos along the hallway entrance, the old black and white images that had always been treated as decoration rather than history. And without fully deciding to, he turned, his steps slower now, less certain, moving toward that hallway as if pulled by something he could no longer ignore. The staff near the back parted slightly, not out of command, but out of shared curiosity, watching as Daniel reached the wall where the older photographs hung, their glass surfaces catching the same warm light. And for a second, he hesitated, his hand hovering just inches from the frame before finally lifting it, pulling it gently from its place. The room watched without speaking as he turned it toward himself, his eyes scanning the image, and then stopping, locking onto a face that matched the one standing only a few feet away, younger, stronger, but unmistakably the same, standing in front of the original version of the restaurant. The name different, the design simpler, but the foundation clear. Daniel's breath caught, not loudly, but enough to shift his posture, his shoulders lowering slightly, as if something inside him had just released its grip, and he turned slowly, the photograph still in his hand, his gaze returning to Elijah, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but recognizing, fully now, undeniably. A murmur moved through the room, quiet but present, carried in the way people leaned toward one another, in the way eyes widened, because the confirmation had moved from suggestion to fact, from possibility to reality, and there was no longer space for doubt. The older man near the aisle nodded once more, a small, firm motion, as if sealing the truth. In place, while the young girl stood still, her expression softened, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet understanding that felt older than her years. Daniel took a step back toward the center of the room, the photograph still held carefully in his hand, and for the first time since the moment had begun, his posture no longer carried authority, it carried awareness, and when he spoke, his voice was different, lower, steadier, but stripped of the certainty that had defined it before. "This is you," he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. And the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have. Elijah did not respond immediately, because he did not need to. The truth was already present, already seen, and when he finally nodded, it was a small motion, calm, without emphasis, as if confirming something that had never required proof to begin with. Daniel's grip on the frame tightened slightly, not in tension, but in recognition of its significance, and he glanced down at it once more, then back at Elijah, the distance between them now defined not by status, but by the moment they shared, a moment where everything that had been assumed had been overturned. The room remained still, but it was no longer the stillness of tension. It was the stillness of understanding, of something settling into place, and Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of everything he had just realized, his shoulders lowering further, his stance no longer rigid, no longer guarded. And though he had not yet spoken the words that would follow, it was clear in the way he stood, in the way he looked at Elijah, that the shift was complete, that the truth had not only been revealed, it had been accepted, and nothing in that room would return to what it had been before. Daniel Whitmore did not move immediately after the realization settled, because movement now required intention, and intention required understanding, and for the first time since the moment began, he seemed to be measuring both, standing there with the photograph still in his hand, as if it carried more than an image, as if it held a weight he had not been prepared to carry. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer waiting for proof, it was waiting for response, and Daniel felt it in the way every eye lingered, not demanding, not accusing, but present, expectant, and he drew a slow breath before stepping forward, closing the distance that had once been defined by authority but now felt defined by something else entirely. When he reached Elijah, he did not extend the photograph immediately. Instead, he looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the lines of his face, the steadiness of his posture, the quiet dignity that had never left him even when he had been asked to lower himself. And there was a pause there, a moment where words could have been chosen carefully, constructed to protect pride. But Daniel did not reach for those words. He let the moment guide him instead. "I was wrong," he said, and the sentence was simple, unembellished, but it landed with a clarity that filled the room, because it was not spoken defensively, not softened by explanation. It was direct, grounded, and real, and for a second, it seemed as though the air itself shifted in response. He lowered the photograph slightly, his hands no longer holding it as evidence, but as something that needed to be returned, and he extended it toward Elijah with a steadiness that had replaced the control he once relied on, his voice quieter now, but no less clear. "I should have seen you, not what I assumed." And there was no attempt to justify, no attempt to explain away the moment that had already passed, just an acknowledgement of it. Elijah accepted the photograph without hesitation, his fingers closing around it with the same quiet care as before, and for a brief moment, their hands occupied the same space, not in conflict, not in hierarchy, but in something closer to understanding. And Elijah's gaze met Daniel's again, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with something deeper, something that did not need to prove anything. The older man near the aisle exhaled softly, as if releasing a tension he had not realized he was holding, while the young girl leaned slightly into her mother, her expression calm now, the uncertainty replaced by a quiet sense that something important had just happened, something she might not fully explain, but would remember. Daniel straightened slightly, not returning to his earlier posture, but finding a new one, less rigid, more grounded, and he glanced briefly around the room, not to reclaim authority, but to acknowledge the presence of those who had witnessed the moment, his voice carrying just enough to reach them. This place, he said, pausing as if choosing the words with care, was built on something better than what I showed today. And the statement did not seek approval. It did not ask for forgiveness. It simply recognized the truth that had been revealed. Elijah listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, and when Daniel finished, there was a moment where nothing more needed to be said, because the shift had already occurred, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet acknowledgement of what had been overlooked. Elijah gave a small nod, not as acceptance of an apology, but as recognition of the moment itself, and then he adjusted his coat slightly, the fabric settling around him as he turned once more toward the door, his movements calm, unhurried, as if the urgency had never belonged to him in the first place. Daniel did not stop him this time, did not step in his path, but remained where he stood, watching, his expression thoughtful, his posture still, and as Elijah reached the door again, his hand resting briefly on the handle, the room held its quiet once more, not out of tension, but out of respect. And when the door finally opened, letting in a breath of cooler air from outside, Elijah stepped forward, carrying nothing more than what he had brought with him, and yet leaving behind something that could not be easily measured, something that lingered in the stillness, in the light, in the space between those who had witnessed it. And Daniel stood there, not as the man who had controlled the room, but as someone who had finally seen it differently. The door closed softly behind Elijah, not with a sound that demanded attention, but with one that settled into the space like a final note, quiet and complete. And for a moment, no one inside the restaurant moved, as if the room itself needed to adjust to the absence he left behind. The warm light still hung over the tables, the glasses still caught reflections, the low hum of the city outside filtered faintly through the glass. But something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be rearranged back into what it had been before, and Daniel Whitmore stood where he was, his gaze lingering on the door long after it had closed, his posture still, but no longer rigid, no longer defined by control, instead shaped by the weight of a moment that had changed the way he saw the space around him. He glanced down at his hands, empty now, as if expecting something to still be there, then slowly lifted his eyes again, this time not toward the center of the room, but toward the hallway where the old photographs hung, and without urgency, without announcement, he walked back toward them, each step quieter than the last, as though he was careful not to disturb something that had only just settled. The staff watched him in silence, not out of fear, but out of awareness, sensing that whatever he did next would not be the same as before. And when he reached the wall, he paused, studying the frames with a new attention, seeing not decoration, not background, but history. And he lifted one of the photographs again, holding it in both hands, his eyes tracing the lines of the image, the younger man standing in front of a simpler version of the building, the original sign, the original purpose, all of it captured in a moment that had somehow been forgotten in practice, even if it remained preserved in glass. Behind him, the older man returned slowly to his seat, his expression thoughtful, while the young girl sat down beside her mother, her gaze drifting once more toward the door, as if marking the path Elijah had taken, committing it quietly to memory. Daniel lowered the frame carefully, not returning it to its exact place, but adjusting it slightly, aligning it more prominently, as if it deserved to be seen, truly seen. And when he stepped back, he did not rush to reclaim the rhythm of the restaurant. He allowed the stillness to remain, allowed the moment to exist. Without trying to smooth it over, a server moved gently through the space, her steps softer now, placing a glass on a table with a care that reflected the change in the room, while a guest near the window folded his hands together, no longer eating, simply sitting with the weight of what he had witnessed. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath steady, and for the first time since the moment had begun, there was no tension in it, only clarity, and he looked around the room again, not as someone managing it, but as someone understanding it, recognizing the people within it not as roles, not as expectations, but as individuals, each carrying something unseen. The ambient music continued, low and distant, but it no longer defined the space. It simply existed within it, and the light that reflected off the polished surfaces now seemed less like perfection and more like presence, illuminating a room that had been reminded of something it had nearly forgotten. Outside, beyond the glass, the evening moved on, cars passing, footsteps fading along the sidewalk, and somewhere within that movement, Elijah walked forward, his figure blending into the rhythm of the city, carrying with him the same quiet dignity he had always held, unchanged by what had happened, unaffected in the way that mattered most. Inside, Daniel remained still for a moment longer, then turned slightly, his shoulders relaxed, his expression no longer guarded, and though he said nothing more, the silence he held was no longer empty. It was full, carrying the echo of a lesson that did not need to be spoken again, because it had already been seen, already been understood, and in that quiet, the room did not return to what it had been. It became something else, something closer to what it was always meant to be, held together not by control, but by awareness, and by the simple, steady recognition of the people within it.